session, so I think we can get started. This is early Cather, and it might be the first Cather panel I've ever seen that has papers in sort of 3 different genres. Cather's early drama reviews, Cather's poetry, and then Cather's fiction. So I'm very excited just about that, the diversity of texts. I would ask, if you haven't, please silence your cell phones, and we will hold questions as usual until all of our presenters have finished.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Xuesong Zhou. I'm from China, from Zhou University. And now I'm a visiting scholar of University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And very fortunately, I am with the mentor of Melissa Hofstad. And I am very excited today. I feel quite honored to come to the hometown of Willa Cather, whom I studied and taught for many years. So I really think I am very lucky, and this is really a very important moment for myself, for my life, to share with you. Thank you for your time here. Thank you for being here. And I really like Nebraska people and all those fans of Willa Cather. Thank you. So today, my topic is reading dramas, Willa Cather as a drama critic. Long before Willa Cather was known as the novelist of the soil, she had a professional career in journalism from 1893 to 1912, which was regarded as by James Woodruff as a long apprenticeship that leads to her mature artistry. In the beginning, the young student of University of Nebraska started to review plays on the local newspaper, Nebraska State Journal. In the 1890s, quote, the greatest actors often appeared in the theaters of Lincoln, end quote. And Cather, quote, very soon acquired a reputation as the liveliest and least inhibited reviewer in the Midwest. Willa Cather was fond of drama since she was living in Red Cloud. The barnstorming companies always brought about breathless, rapt attention and a deep feeling, quote, for little Cather. Years of drama watching gave her a keen eye, and she was known for her pungent drama reviews. The managing editor of Nebraska State Journal remembered that, quote, many an actor of national reputation wondered, on coming to Lincoln, what would appear next morning from the pen of that meat-axe girl, whom all of them had heard. And in 1895, the successful theater producer Gustav Frohman had a discussion on criticism with Willa Cather, saying that, quote, poor companies begin to tremble long before they get Lincoln. The reason why Cather was known as the meat-axe young girl may be firstly related to her insistence of being honest. She did not stand in awe of the renowned actors, but could recognize the merits in many young, little-known actors. She believed that, quote, critics' first instincts are the best because they are the truest. And the highest art in a timely review is to reproduce, to some extent, the atmosphere of the play, to laugh if it was funny, to weep a little if it is sad, to say plainly and frankly if it was bad, end quote. Here, the usage of the expression of highest art implies that Cather had very high standards for drama. Actually, in her critiques, she often used the adjective highest to modify art. For instance, she praises Mr. James Canfield's comedy as of the highest type, comments the acting of Fowler Company as, quote, not of the highest art, eulogizes Shakespeare's plays as, quote, the highest triumph of human art, and argues that, quote, the highest kind of art, whether in comedy or tragedy, is that which is elevated by high artistic sincerity. Interestingly, Cather's fondness of using the adjective high in her early drama criticism persisted. In 1920, in the essay on the art of fiction, she states her view on the higher artistic process. And in 1922, she again elaborates on, quote, higher process of art in the famous essay, The Novel des Meubles. Even though the then nationally acclaimed writer mainly used the high in its comparative rather than the superlative form, which implies a fading of extremity in her language, there is something that hasn't changed and has always been there. This article aims to expound the connotation of the highest art for Cather as a drama critic, and to explore the causes of such a view of art so as to gain a better understanding of Cather's aesthetics in writing. In March 1894, though for the most part, Cather gave high praises of the celebrated actress Julia Marlowe, her performance in the comedy The Love Chase, she held that the actress had a significant defect. Quote, she lives too beautifully to live very hard, dies too gracefully to die very effectively. And then she proposed her view of the highest art by using an alternative adjective, greatest. The greatest art in acting is not to please and charm and delight, but to move and thrill, not to play a part daintily and delightfully, but with power and passion. Later in the same year, Cather expressed a similar view on Miss Marlowe again. She, quote, she knows nothing of the stronger, coarser emotion, the ungovernable fury of the blood with which high tragedy deals. Here, the stronger, coarser emotions echoes with her previous emphasis on power and passion, which she defined as quintessential attribute of the greatest art in acting. Cather's advocacy for power and passion can also be seen through her criticism on some critiques of modern art. In 1894, she wrote, the curse of every school and phase of modern art is the guilt of drawing-room critics. Critics who sneer at the great and the powerful and adore the clever and the dainty. They refuse to read anything moving than the rivals. This race of critics has declared Ruskin and Wagner and Turner and Jessica Blase. They take books that look well on their tables, the music that is not too loud for their parlors, the pictures that hang well on their walls. Here, the contrast in words between powerful and dainty, combined with the sarcasm on the mediocrity of drawing-room critics' tastes, again shows Cather's affirmation of power and passion in art. However, for Cather, the power and passion in drama playing is different from some pompous way of acting, like ranting or raving when speaking. Rather, she criticizes excessive emotion, which is unnecessary and improper. In her very first article as a drama critic on Nebraska State Journal in 1893, Cather criticized an actor for acting too much, who, quote, declaims constantly and hisses an invitation to dinner as if it were a summons to the block. Cather also wrote a review of the same play on the student newspaper of University of Nebraska, Hesperian, where she was the editor, commented on the actor's key of his voice as too high, arguing that he has one great fault of modern actors: he rants, and lacks the delicacy and discrimination to know where excessive emotion becomes grotesque. Then the next year, in a review of On Faust, Cather again criticized this, quote, great fault of modern actors by contrasting the actor with the great British actor Henry Irving, who, quote, never rants, never growls, never calls down a whole orchestra of thunder to reinforce a very ordinary sentence. Since excessive emotion is denied, then according to Cather, what kind of performance can be acclaimed as having power and passion? Or how can an actor or actress gain power and passion in playing? To this question, the answer given by the young Cather is in the performer, him or herself. In fact, when she mentioned the greatest art in acting is to play with power and passion, there is a prerequisite the soul, which is the only thing, quote, that gives art the right to be. In another drama critique, Cather reiterated this view that art's only excuse for being is a heart or sincerity. For Cather, there should be a heart or soul in the actor or actress. When reviewing the excellent performance of William H. Crane in Brother Jones, she described the actor as an artist with a great heart, for which she said she doesn't know any higher praise for him. Nevertheless, this attribution of greatest art to the performance having a heart or soul is still very abstract, which can hardly be regarded as a practical guide to acting. In fact, it was not until Cather had become an experienced writer of novels that she was able to develop a methodology. In the essay, the novel Des Meublés of 1922, Cather still values passion as the core of a drama. In saying that, to make a drama, a man needed one passion and 4 walls. She clearly proposes that, quote, the higher process of art are all processions of simplification, which is metaphorically described as, quote, throwing all the furniture out of the window and along with it all the meaningless reiterations concerning physical sensations, all the tiresome old patterns, and leave the room as bare as the stage of a Greek theater. What Cather means is that it is unnecessary to depict everything with the same detail in a novel. Rather, a writer should have a unifying passion or emotion to determine whether the presentation of certain material objects is proper and necessary. That's why, she says, the novelists must learn to write and then he must unlearn it, just as the modern painter learns to draw and then learns when utterly to disregard his accomplishments, when to subordinate it to a higher and truer effect. Even though Cather is talking about novel writing, the comparison of a room de meublé to a Greek theater implies that this methodology of simplification can be at least applied to drama playing. Therefore, for the established writer Cather, the way to create the greatest art with power and passion is through simplification. Sorry, a little slow. However, though Cather did not solve the problem of how to until about 20 years later, she did consistently have her understanding of what the greatest art should be like ever since she was a young drama critic. Then, why did Cather attribute the greatest art to power and passion? Firstly, it is not difficult to recognize that power and passion are 2 key words in Romanticism. Young Cather's repetitive usage of them shows her particular favor of high intensity in life, which can be attributed to the influence originating from Edmund Burke, the precursor of Romanticism. In a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, 1757, Burke proposes the sublime as productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. This argument gave the English Romanticism a theoretical foundation and a legitimacy to their artistic expression of the strongest emotion. In the manifesto of English Romanticist movement, Preface to Lyrical Ballads, William Wordsworth defines poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. According to Bernice Sloat, during Cather's university years, she read a lot, and her favorites, quote, were always 19th century romantics. Susan J. Rosowski had long ago pointed out that Cather's early principles in writing, quote, resembled those common to Romanticism, especially English tradition of Romanticism, mainly in 4 aspects: a dualism of mind and matter, the ability of imagination, a deep understanding of commonplace life, and a gift of sympathy. This analysis is quite insightful, yet mainly concerning about conception and ability. Rosowski seems to neglect an emotional and passionate aspect in Cather's view of art. In fact, emotion is something that Cather cares a lot about in a piece of artistic work. As early as in 1891, Cather argued that the charm of Hamlet lies in his emotion rather than intellect. Quote, the emotional and intentional plane of life is infinitely higher than the intellectual. It is the source of every great purpose, of every exalted aim. It is not attained by study. It is not seen through a telescope, nor reached by mastering the pages of a Latin grammar. Obviously, young Cather put extremely high value on emotion. 30 years later, Cather again contended that emotion is the indispensable pillar of a work, without which the writing would be unworthy of an artist. She regards Tolstoy as the role model in whose writing, quote, the clothes, the dishes, the haunting interiors of those old Moscow houses are always so much a part of the emotions of the people that they are perfectly synthesized. Secondly, Cather, the drama critic's frequent repetition of the highest or greatest art, also denotes a hierarchy in her view of art. Indeed, it was not uncommon for literary or art critics to use words like high or low in the end of the 19th century. Historian Lawrence Levine points out that at that time, adjectives of high, low, rude, lesser, higher, lower, beautiful, modern, legitimate, vulgar, popular, true, pure, highbrow, lowbrow were applied to such nouns as arts or culture almost ad infinitum. It was a time when the so-called high culture was constructed and differentiated from the low culture. A very representative example of this transformation is the performance and the reception of Shakespeare's plays in America. In the early half of the 19th century, Shakespeare's plays were, quote, part and parcel of popular culture, which were presented as part of the same milieu inhabited by magicians, dancers, singers, acrobats, minstrels, and comics. But in the last one-third of the 19th century, Shakespeare had become highbrow culture for elite circles. Willa Cather herself also took part in this transformation. Her essay on Hamlet mentioned above is entitled Shakespeare and Hamlet, the Real Significance of the Play, which indicates a debate and a clarification over what kind of taste the audience should have toward the play. In the essay, she calls Shakespeare as the man who wrote the greatest drama in the English language, and uses similarly extreme words to express her worship in sentences like, none of Hamlet's great soliloquies are premeditated or are perfectly spontaneous. The construction of a cultural hierarchy in the end of the 19th century in America was related to some extent with the British aestheticism. For Jonathan Freeman, British aestheticism is not simply a literary or artistic tendency or movement, but an, quote, intricately articulated arena in which new definitions of the aesthetic and its relation to the social were negotiated and renegotiated, which helped to create the concept of high culture. And at the turn of the century, quote, the taste, the perception, the very attitudes of British aestheticism had thoroughly penetrated the American cultural consciousness, end quote. As a drama critic of Nebraska State Journal and the editor of University Student newspaper, Willa Cather was required to see every theater production, to read the news in the paper for which she worked. So she, quote, was very much a part of her time and her culture, end quote. In this sense, Cather's drama criticism, with repetitive expression of the highest or the greatest art, not only constituted, but also fostered the construction of cultural hierarchy in the end of the 19th century. Thank you, that's all. this one?
Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is James Jaap. I'm a teaching professor of English at Penn State Greater Allegheny, and I've been a member of the Willa Cather Board of Governors since 2018. So today my paper is entitled Cather's Poems in the Critic, Jeanette L. Gilder, Charles Hanson Town, and Newspaper Publication. Willa Cather's volume of poems, April Twilights, was published in 1903 and again with significant revisions in 1923. For 2 decades, the authoritative texts on the publication history of Cather's poems have been Bernice Sloat's 1968 bibliography that concludes her edited volume of April Twilights, and Joan Crane's 1982 bibliography of all Cather's work. While these sources are important, the digitization of historic newspapers and periodicals has rendered them outdated. Recently, I have located several of Cather's poems published in a much wider selection of newspapers and periodicals than previously known. And today I will focus on 3 that first appeared in the Critic, an important literary magazine founded in 1881 by the influential editor and critic Jeanette L. Gilder and her younger brother Joseph. The 3 poems are Grandmother, Think Not I Forget, Asphodel, and Winter at Delphi. While Grandmother is easily the most published of the 3, all have a greater publishing history than previously known. A discussion of these histories reveals several interesting points related to Cather's poetry, her personal and literary acquaintances, and her reputation and readership as a poet in the early 20th century. Cather published her first poem, Shakespeare, A Freshman Theme, in the June 1st, 1892 Hesperian at the University of Nebraska, and over the next 7 years would publish approximately 16 poems and translations in the Hesperian, the Home Monthly, the Lincoln Courier, and Library, the short-lived Pittsburgh literary magazine, to which she also contributed multiple nonfiction pieces. In April 1900, she got her first big poetry break, and Grandmother, Think Not I Forget, was published in the Critic. Cather would publish 2 other poems in the magazine, Asphodel in December 1900 and Winter at Delphi in September 1901. And up on the screen here, we see the cover of the April 1901, The Critic, which features Cather's first poem. Of these 3, Grandmother has the most extensive publication history, which should be expected given its prominence as the first poem in all editions of April Twilights. According to Sloat and Crane's bibliographies, the poem first appeared in the April 1st, 1900 edition of the Critic, published in late March, and then in the Pittsburgh Leader on March 29th, the Lincoln Courier on April 28th, and the May 1900 edition of Current Literature. Recently, I have located an additional 8 publications of the poem before April Twilights appeared in 1903. Soon after appearing in the Critic, Grandmother appeared in the Boston Evening Transcript on March 31st, then the Lincoln, Nebraska State Journal on April 3rd. The version is notable because it includes a short intro, quote, Miss Willa Cather has a poem entitled Grandmother, Think Not I Forget in the April Critic. The following extracts show its general character. The newspaper then cuts the 3rd stanza. Lack of space does not seem to be the reason for the edit. The poem is followed by a personal column listing out-of-town Lincoln residents and others who are visiting. 2 weeks later, on April 15th, the Kansas City Times published the poem on its literary page, and on May 17th, the poem appeared in the Seymour Daily Democrat of Seymour, Indiana. Both include the 3rd stanza, and all 4 include the tag Willa Cather in the April Critic. Nearly a year later, during the summer of 1901, the poem found new life in 4 Kansas newspapers. On May 9th, Grandmother appeared in the Burns Citizens of Burns, Kansas, next to a column about suggestions about celery, and another entitled Time to Prevent Potato Scabs. On May 19th, the poem was published in the Attica Independent, in the Solomon Valley Democrat of Minneapolis, Kansas on June 20th, and in the Portage Daily Register on July 12th. All appear to be from the same syndicate, for the poem is followed in all 4 newspapers by a story entitled The Next Best Thing by the mysterious author, The Housekeeper. All include the 4 poem, and all conclude with a similar tag, Willa Cather in Critic. Between 1903 and 1923, Kernel was republished several further times in newspapers, many previously unnoted. The poem appeared in the LA Times on June 3rd, 1903, and on June 25th in the Maitland Weekly Mercury of New South Wales, Australia. With the quote, "Some recent American verse which has attracted attention in England." You all could still hear me, I think. That's how loud it is. Is that on? Yes? Okay. It appeared in the Maitland Weekly Mercury of New South Wales, Australia, with the quote, "Some recent American verse which has attracted attention in England is Miss Willa Cather's April Twilights." The column then cuts the 2nd and 3rd stanzas. On April 19th, 1909, Grandmother was published in the Kingston Whig Standard of Ontario, Canada, and then 10 days later in the April 29th McClure's. On April 23rd, 1911, the New York Times published the poem in response to an April 2nd queries and answer column on books, authors, poems, and missing lines, and a decade later, the Omaha World Herald published the poem on July 24th, 1921. Now, I will return to this poem in a moment. Cather's second poem in Critic, Asphodel, first appeared in the December 1900 edition of the Critic, and according to Cather's bibliographies, the Nebraska State Journal on December 17th, before publication in April Twilights. Recent discoveries, however, indicate the poem was published at least 7 additional times before 1903, 8 additional times, pardon me. These include the Nebraska State Journal again on December 9th, that's twice in 8 days, and the Brooklyn Eagle on December 13th. A day later, December 14th, the poem appeared in both the Bloomfield Journal of Bloomfield, Nebraska, and the Battle Creek Republican of Battle Creek, Nebraska. The poem then appeared on December 23rd in the St. Louis Republican and in the New York Times on December 30th, again in the New York Times, which includes the Sparks and Magazine columns, which included experts from a variety of literary magazines and journals, including Harper's, Scribner's, and The Critic. Finally, the poem was published in the Courier Journal of Louisville, Kentucky, and the Brooklyn Citizen on January 6, 1901. All include the tag Willa Cather in December Critic. Between 1903 and 1923, I have found no publications of the poem. Cather did include it in April Twilights and other poems in 1923, and I have located one further publication in the March 22nd, 1929 edition of the Kansas City Star. Cather's third and final poem in Critic has a much shorter publishing history. Winter at Delphi, first published in the Critic in September 1901, and according to Cather bibliographies, not again until April Twilights in 1903. Recent research shows the poem was published at least 2 additional times in the Kansas City Star in September 1901 and the Lincoln, Nebraska State Journal on October 12, 1902. It also appeared in the June 20th, 1903 New York Times in an unsigned review of April Twilights. Cather's poem, incidentally, The Tavern, is also included in the review. Cather did not include Winter at Delphi in April Twilights and other poems, and I have located no further publications after 1923. Why does this matter, other than me wasting time on the internet? The publication of these 3 poems, I argue, mark an important stage in Cather's creative career. To publish in the Critic the review of literature Quote, "The review of literature, the fine arts, music, and drama was a big deal." Founded in 1881 by Jeanette Gilder and her younger brother Joseph, the Critic had high aspirations. And this is their mission statement in the first volume. "The Critic comes forward to supply a need which all educated Americans will acknowledge. Science, the arts, and the various branches of commerce have innumerable exponents in the press. Literature has few. In New York, it has none. The fecundity of the book world, which is never so great as now, and the craving for literary news is daily increasing. In the Critic, literature will have the first place." From 1881 to 1884, the magazine appeared bi-weekly and then shifted to a weekly edition after merging with Good Literature in 1884. It remained a weekly until 1898, focusing on reviews of novels, music, and theater. In 1898, the magazine shifted again to a monthly volume and increased the quantity of articles and poetry. And that's when Willa was publishing in the magazine. In 1906, the magazine was absorbed by Putnam's and ceased publication. In 25 years, contributors included Oscar Wilde, Frederick Douglass, Emma Lazarus, Bret Harte, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Walt Whitman, who primarily contributed prose late in his life, including the essay By Emerson's Grave in the May 6, 1882 edition. A popular feature of the magazine was Jeanette Gilder's The Lounger, a sort of gossip column about artists and the literati. Jeanette Gilder, a very interesting woman, I believe her influence on American literature in the late 19th and early 20th century should not be underestimated, although many have. Born in Flushing, New York in 1849, Gilder went to work at the age of 15 after her father died in the Civil War. In 1868, she joined the staff of the Newark Morning Register, recently established by her older brother Richard, the influential founder of Century magazine. She became editor of the paper, worked as a Newark correspondent for the New York Tribune, and then became literary editor for the New York Herald. In January 1881, she established the Critic and became sole editor in 1901. After Critic was absorbed by Putnam's in 1906, she served as an associate editor until 1911. During her life, she was prolific. In addition to the Critic, she contributed columns to a variety of newspapers and magazines, edited several collections, including Pen Portraits of Literary Women, Authors at Home from 1888, Masterpieces of the World's Best Literature in 8 volumes, 1905. She also published several plays, a novel, and 2 autobiographies that brought some critical acclaim: Autobiography of a Tomboy in 1900 and The Tomboy at Work in 1904. In her later years, she published columns in Women's Home Companion, the Chicago Tribune, and McClure's, where she likely had contact with Willa. In 1895, according to Frank Luther Mott, Gilder established a literary brokerage, Miss Gilder's Syndicate, and negotiated publication and dramatization rights for her clients. I have not located much on Miss Gilder's Syndicate other than a few references and images. Chuck Johanningsmeyer, I should pronounce his name correctly, important book on publishing syndicates in the late 19th century, does not specifically mention Gilder, although I suspect Jeanette was working through Century publications. On the right is the list of the authors she represented, and from what I think, this is from 1911. She died in 1916. Was Willa a part of Gilder's Syndicate? While it could explain the continuing publication of the poems, especially Grandmother, in the months and years after it appeared in the Critic, I don't think so. She had not yet the publishing record for Gilder, and although the Critic published several poems, in a letter in April 1901, Cather does not appear to know Gilder very well. At the time, Cather was shopping her player letters, and in April 1901, she writes to Dorothy Canfield Fisher, quote, "I had thought that Miss Gilder might be able to use some of them in the Critic. Have you any means of access to her? I believe she thinks rather well of me. If she were to see some half dozen of these better ones, she might consider the scheme," end quote. Apparently, that means of access was Dorothy's father, James Canfield, although it was not for player letters, but for April Twilights. In a letter to Dorothy from May 1903, Cather writes, quote, "I'm exultant about your father getting the books to such good people. Miss Gilder wrote me a very nice note. We'll have the book reviewed in the July Critic," end quote. The book was reviewed in the July Critic, but not by Gilder. Gilder, however, did review April Twilights for the May 23rd, 19 edition of the Chicago Tribune, and includes all 4 stanzas of Grandmother, praising Cather as a poet. Quote, "Once in a while, one happens upon the work of a real poet. I have seen the work of Miss Cather from time to time in magazines, but I know nothing of her beyond the fact that she lives in Pittsburgh and is connected to a newspaper in that city. Read the first poem in this little volume, which I will quote, and tell me if you do not find something real in it." Gilder's review column appeared again in the Tacoma Daily Ledger on June 7th, 1903, and the poem was again included in its entirety. Why the fib about not knowing Cather? I have no idea. She obviously knew more about Willa than just the fact that she lived in Pittsburgh and was connected to a newspaper there. By 1903, the two were in personal contact. Gilder continued to champion Cather's work throughout the remainder of her life. In addition to the personal note and the reviews, Gilder praised the Troll Garden in the December 1905 Critic. Quote, "There is real promise in these half-dozen short stories," Gilder writes. "Miss Cather has sincerity and no small degree of insight. In fact, when she writes her novel, one may venture it will be far too good to be one of the bestsellers of the month." Great. She also reviewed the proofs of O Pioneers. In her glowing review of the novel in the May 24th, 1913 Chicago Tribune, Gilder presciently asserts, "She is going to be a force in American fiction, there can be no doubt," end quote. O Pioneers, she writes, quote, "will put her in the front ranks of American fiction." Gilder also reviewed S.S. McClure's autobiography in the May 23rd, 1914 Chicago Tribune, and specifically notes Cather's contribution. She also likely worked directly with Cather, as Gilder wrote a weekly book review column for McClure's in 1914 and 1915. Jeanette Gilder died in 1916 before her prediction came true, and Cather had become a force in American fiction. She obviously recognized Cather's potential in 1900, and her early advocacy of Cather's work, both in publishing and reviewing, contributed to Cather's growing reputation and readership as a poem and fiction writer in the early 20th century. A couple more minutes here. Let's now briefly return to Grandmother. After April Twilights and Other Poems was published in 1923, the poem again had a bit of a revival, thanks to another influential critic, Charles Hanson Towne, who included the poem in his column, Poems I Love, one of his poems. Between 1923 and 1927, the poem appeared at least 10 times in newspapers across the nation. And I'm not going to read these in the habit of time. All versions of the poem include a brief personal introduction by Towne, and all eliminate the third stanza. Charles Hanson Towne, known as Charlie, was an American editor, writer, poet, and literary agent. Born in Kentucky, he worked at Cosmopolitan, then at Smart Set from 1901 to 1907. He joined the staff of the Delineator as fiction editor from 1907 to 1910. Then from 1914 to 1920, he was editor at McClure's, where he would have met and worked with Cather and likely Gilder. One could also say he might have saved Willa from a bit of controversy in 1916. After publication of The Diamond Mine, the Jewish Anti-Defamation League called out Cather for her anti-Semitism when describing the character of Miletus Pappus. quote, he was a vulture of a vulture race and he had the beak of one. Towns' reply, as McClure's managing editor, was published in the October edition of American Jewish World with the title, A Graceful Apology. Town writes, quote, no one regrets more than I the insertion of that paragraph in Miss Cather's story. How it got by us, I don't know. The Anti-Defamation League appears to have accepted the apology, as you can see, entitling it A Graceful. Like Jeanette Gilder, Town was prolific. He published numerous volumes of verse, fiction, travel writing, newspaper columns, and today you may occasionally find one of his poems pop up on a Poem of the Day website or in an anthology. Between 1922 and 27, he published the popular column Poems I Love in newspapers across the nation, and a limited search shows at least over 1,800 appearances of the column over 5 years. He would provide a brief personal introduction, then quote the poem. All the poems were published in a variety of newspapers across the country. In his Cather column, Town praises the recent Pulitzer winner who, quote, wrote poetry and excellent poetry almost from the beginning of her career. April Twilights, he notes, contains work of a high order, and he points out the poetry in her fiction. Throughout her prose, one finds these golden sentences, long passages of description, which only a writer of verse could get upon paper. Grandmother, Town asserts, achieves an eminence as great as that she has already attained through her novels and her amazing stories. Cather obviously knew Town fairly well. She worked with him at McClure's. In 1922, the two seemed to have a bit of a dust-up. Zoe Akins, who was friends with both Cather and Town, gave Town a proof copy of A Lost Lady. Town was working for Metropolitan Magazine and hoped to serialize it. Cather was not happy with Akins, and she expresses her dislike of Town. Quote, I don't want anything to do with Charlie Town. I dislike him and his kind so much. Then I'll just skip on here. People like Town make me physically ill, and I can't owe them anything. I only wish I could keep my name out of their mouths and my books out of their hands, even in print. Town makes no mention of the spat. Perhaps he didn't know. He claims he closed the deal in his autobiography, but Metropolitan folded. If Town had any animosity towards her, he doesn't show it. He would praise her throughout his career. Cather was aware of his praise. In a November 22nd letter written, interesting, the same time she writes to Akins, Cather writes to Town, let me take this occasion to say that I appreciate the friendly feeling you have expressed in several reviews that have brought to my attention. Later in 1935, in the Washington Herald, Town would call Lucy Gayheart perfection, and in 1936, he praised Not Under 40. This is prose that rings and sing. Can anyone match it in the country? Why does this matter? Jeanette Gilder and Charles Hanson Town were two influential literary critics in the late 19th and early 20th century who championed Cather's poetry and fiction throughout their careers. By publishing her poems in their columns and magazines, both Gilder and Town presented Cather's poetry, specifically Grandmother, Think Not I Forget, and to a lesser extent Asphodel and Winter at Delphi, to a much larger readership than previously considered. Today, Cather is recognized mainly for her fiction and not her poetry. That has not always been the case. Sorry.
And then how do I change? Okay. Never mind, I'll just start talking. My name's Elaine Smith. I'm from the University of South Florida, retired, thankfully. And I live in Temple Terrace, Florida, named after the oranges. What? What? Close to the mic. Like this? No. Am I close enough? Okay. Not sure I can. Okay, got to get organized here. I'm not sure I can see it on there. All right, here we'll try it this way. Kernel and Nimbus, Willa Cather's Connections to Joseph Conrad, or Why Behind the Singer Tower is Not a Muckraking Story. This paper discusses the ways Willa Cather's short story Behind the Singer Tower parallels Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, and considers Cather's possible purposes in following Conrad so closely. I begin with two quotations. The yarns of seamen have a direct simplicity, the whole meaning of which lies in the shell of a cracked nut. But Marlowe was not typical if his propensity to spin yarns be accepted, and to him the meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale, which brought it out only as a glow brings out a haze, in the likeness of one of these misty halos that are sometimes made visible by the spectral illumination of moonshine. Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, 1899. There is a kind of story that ought to tell itself, the story of action. There's another kind of story that ought to be told, and I mean the emotional story, which tries to be much more like music than it tries to be like drama. The story that tries to evoke and leave merely a picture, a mood. That was what Conrad tried to do, and he did it very well. This is in a letter of Cather's from October 24, 1924. Willa Cather's admiration for Joseph Conrad has been well established. In 1933, over NBC radio, Cather spoke of the modern American novel in this, her only radio broadcast. She credits first, quote, the great Russians of the 19th century, and then Conrad, with liberating American writers from the conventions of Victoria fiction. Tired old themes, threadbare subjects, romance, and moral endings. She describes the process thus, quote, the old icebergs began melting, the old forms began to break up. Joseph Conrad wrote The Nigger of the Narcissus without a woman, and no glory or promotion for anybody at the end. As this conference has proved, Cather was an avid and attentive reader, and borrowed freely from those she most admired, James, Tolstoy, Eliot, and Flaubert. Yet, Peter Mallios is among many critics who have singled out Behind the Singer Tower for its exceptionally close and continuous borrowing. Mallios calls Behind the Singer Tower Cather's clearest literary encounter with Conrad, a, quote, transparent, self-conscious imitation in large part of Heart of Darkness. Cather published Behind the Singer Tower in Collier's magazine in 1912 while she was still managing editor of McClure's, just before she quit to see if she could abandon journalism and support herself with serious writing. She had trouble placing this odd, troubling, sometimes unpleasant story. Critics have called it muddled, dense, overcrowded, claiming that Cather was, quote, off on the wrong foot, and that her subject was, unquote, uncongenial. Today's readers may find certain aspects of Behind the Singer Tower objectionable. Cather herself calls it yellow, meaning full of sensationalized, quote, red meat, the gory detail that, quote, bites the tongue and sells papers. Cather's characters casually use racist and anti-Semitic slurs, and there seems to be a calloused acceptance of injury and death inflicted on the working classes. Quote, window washers, we're told, fall from their scaffolding at the rate of 1 per day. Quote, men, says the villain, are cheaper than machines. We can, therefore, understand why Behind the Singer Tower is sometimes read as a failed attempt at muckraking journalism and as a racist and anti-Semitic text. Yet I would argue that Cather was not especially anti-immigrant nor anti-Semitic, nor was she writing a work to expose the social, economic, or political injustices calling for their reform. Rather, she means her audience to absorb these true details of New York life and ask the question raised by the dying immigrant, ma perche, but why? But why is but another iteration of the question posed by the title. What is behind the Singer Tower? I suggest that Cather uses Conrad's haze-making techniques and obfuscation and indirection to critique the culture of New York and, by extension, cultural practices gaining ascendancy in the United States. Her attack is specifically on a society of seemingly pointless competition, a motif suggested by the Singer Tower itself. In 1908, the Singer Tower was New York's first skyscraper. At 41 stories, it stood the tallest building in the world for 18 months. In 1909, it was surpassed by the MetLife building with 59 stories, until that was in turn surpassed in 1910 by the Woolworth building with 60. Cather was living in New York at the height of this construction boom, the so-called, quote, race for the sky, when remarkable feats of engineering were changing New York's skyline forever. In the story, one character says that the height was the defining feature of the city. Quote, in New York, the matter of height was spoken of jocularly and triumphantly. There was nothing for us but height. We were whipped up the ladder. It was feared that a disaster like a deadly fire would change the view of what New York was all about. Those familiar with Heart of Darkness will notice in the following summary similarities in setting, action, and structure between the two works. Like Heart of Darkness, Behind the Singer Tower begins at dusk. 6 men of various professions are on a motor launch, quote, taking a turn down the Hudson River to Staten Island. On the launch are 2 newspaper men, the unnamed frame narrator and Johnson from the Herald, 2 engineers, Fred Hallett, the owner of the launch, and one of his draftsmen, a lawyer, Chambers, from the district attorney's office, and Zablofsky, a young Jewish doctor who works at the Rockefeller Institute. Zablofsky, in my opinion, is the hero of this story and gets more detailed introduction than the others. He was, quote, a very handsome fellow with sad, thoughtful eyes, and we are all fond of him, especially Hallett, who is always teasing him. These men had spent a grueling day dealing with gut-wrenching horrors as they sifted through the wreckage of a disastrous hotel fire. The Mont Blanc Hotel, the New York's finest and most luxurious and expensive hotel, had burned the night before, killing more than 300 important people. Only rich and famous people stayed at the Mont Blanc, as its name implies. As its name implies, it was, quote, the pinnacle of the New York idea, quote, the complete expression of New York in architecture, 35-story hotel, which made the plaza look modest. Its prices, like its proportions, as the newspapers had so often asseverated, outscaled everything in the known world. Nature and human stupidity had combined to create the tragedy. A high wind, oiled wood, flammable upholstery, and fire escapes that melted in the heat had made the fire more deadly. Gliding downriver into the lower bay, that's where we're going in New York. You can see where this launch is going. The launch passes one of the huge new ocean liners, the Ray de Napoli. Its lower decks crowded with immigrants steaming upriver to land her first-class passengers at the new Chelsea docks. The sight of those immigrants inspires Fred Hallett to begin another story of waste and destruction. the death of his friend, Cesarino, a young Italian who 5 years earlier had been part of his crew. They had both worked down in the hole in hellish conditions, laying the structural foundations of the Mont Blanc. I was a boy, says Hallett, just out of tech, when he asked Stanley Merriweather for a job. Merriweather, another MIT graduate, was already running his uncle's lucrative engineering firm and offers Hallett a safer position, a less dangerous position, but Hallett wants experience in deep foundation work. At the mention of Merriweather's name, all the other men on the launch sit up and take notice because the enmity between these two men was, quote, one of the legends of the engineering society. Quote, Stanley Merriweather, the narrator tells us, was the most successful manipulator of structural steel in New York, and Hallett was the most intelligent. Even in college, Hallett had never much liked Merriweather, objecting to his gaudy taste, his lack of conscience, and his insinuating friendliness. The break came when 6 men working on Hallett's crew were killed in a clamshell crashed down upon them because its supporting cable was frayed. Merriweather had known about the cable, but to save time and money, he had resisted getting it replaced. Men are cheaper than machines. One of the men killed was Hallett's buddy, little Cesarino, from the Isle of Ischia. He and Hallett were of an age, both new to New York and lonely, and over the first summer they had become friends. The other bereaved families had been bought off, but Hallett hires the best lawyers in New York and sues Merriweather on behalf of Cesarino's mother. Merriweather explodes. Well, you've chosen your class, sir. You can stay in the hole with the guineas till the end of time for all me. That's where you put yourself. At the end of Hallett's story, the narrator passes judgment. Hallett, he says, was a soft man for an iron age, and it was easy enough to see why Stanley Merriweather had beaten him in the race. There was a string to every contract in New York, and Hallett was always tripping over the string. Cather continues her framed story. The scene shifts as the launch glides downriver, bringing into view the garish ads on the Jersey shore, which I don't have a picture of, blazing across the night, names of beer and perfume and corsets. The men look back at the incandescent lights atop the Singer Tower, and Johnson calls it, whoops, there they are. Johnson calls it a Jewy-looking thing, like a Jewish high priest in the old Bible dictionaries. Zablowski ignores Johnson's rudeness and quietly corrects him. No, it's not Semitic, Johnson. That high-peaked turban is more apt to be Persian, or a Buddha with 2 bright rings in his ears. As the Statue of Liberty appears, now I go to that slide, holding her feeble taper, that's in the gloom, the narrator picks up the theme, comparing Liberty to the Singer Tower. Liberty, he says, has been replaced. She has become, quote, but an archaeological survival. The colossal figure of the Singer Tower watches over the city and the harbor like a presiding genius. The tower is the alien. He has come out of the Asia quietly in the night. No one knew just when or how. Who could have foreseen that she, in her high-mindedness, would ever spawn such a great heathen idol like that, says Hallett. That's what idealism comes to in the end, Zablowski. Liberty, the unexpressed fear in Johnson's remarks and Hallett's teasing is of things foreign. As Emma Lazarus's poem declares, Liberty has opened her gates to immigrants who bring with their unpronounceable names, that's a quote from the story, and strange manners, germs, and diseases. The Singer Tower represents a threat to American ideals, or perhaps the ideals have become obsolete and superannuated, as Liberty's opened her gates to it. Okay, the similarities between Cather's story and The Heart of Darkness are striking. Both are opened as dusk, as I said, with a handful of professional men on a boat. Behind them shine the lights of a great city. Each opening scene frames a story of darkness and disaster. Each author uses darkness to signify the unknowability and confusion of the world, the darkness of the wilderness, and the darkness of the human heart. Not surprisingly, both authors were appreciative readers of Nathaniel Hawthorne. To demonstrate the similarities as a shortcut, I'd like you to listen to the correspondence in language, mood, and tone between Cather's voice and Conrad's, beginning with Cather. There was a brooding mournfulness over the New York harbor, as if the ghost of helplessness and terror were abroad in the darkness. End quote. Quote, the air was dark above Gravesend, and farther back still seemed condensed into a mournful gloom, brooding and motionless over the biggest and greatest town on earth. Conrad again. The sun set, the dust fell on the stream, and lights began to appear on the shore. London was still marked ominously by the sky, a brooding gloom and sunshine, a lurid glare under the stars. Cather. In the misty spring sky, only a few stars shone pale and far apart. The place seemed unnaturally quiet, and the night unnaturally black. There are other parallels. Referencing ancient empires and fallen gods, both writers project a very long view of human history, a perspective that suggests the impermanence of the current political and social arrangements and the brevity of a single life, but a spark, but a flash. Each author asks his readers to imagine themselves in a more dangerous, less privileged position. Quote, this also has been one of the dark places of the earth, says Marlowe. Light came out of this river since, but darkness was here yesterday. Imagine the feelings of a young Roman commander sent from the center of civilization to the very ends of the world. Confronted with fog, tempest, disease, exile, and death, they must have been dying like flies, and they had to live in the midst of the incomprehensible, which is also detestable. Suppose, says Fred Hallett, we had gone to the work for some great super and powerful nation in Asia that had a civilization built on sciences we knew nothing of. And suppose we knew that to these masters of ours, we were absolutely meaningless as social beings, were waste for their machines. So both novelists asked us to imagine the confusion, the loneliness, and fear of exiles and immigrants. The second are the internal narrators, Marlowe and, the differences, I'm talking about similarities. Now the differences between Cather's work and Conrad's are as significant as the similarities because they suggest Cather's purpose in lining her work up against Conrad's. For example, the narrator of The Heart of Darkness calls up, although in deep irony, England's glorious past, saying, the River Thames, it had known and served all the great men of whom the nation is proud, the great knights errant of the sea. It had borne all the ships whose names are like jewels flashing in the night of time. Cather, on the other hand, seems at pains to present New York City as its most modern, shiny, new, up to date. No mention here of a noble past or the green breast of the New World. This New York is all ambition, bluster and bustle, extravagance, excess, clamor, and commotion. On the Nelly, there's harmony forged from hard work and shared experience. Quote, between us, there was the bond of the sea, holding our hearts together through long periods of separation and making us tolerant of each other's yarns. This easy camaraderie contrasts with the prickly tension between the men on the motor launch, where the conversation seems semi-aggressive as the men tease each other and jockey pointlessly for position. The motor launch is noisier, there's more chatter. On the yawl, we mostly hear Marlowe's sane, steady, contemplative voice, trying to make sense of his confounding experience. In telling Kurtz's story, Conrad critiques the assumptions of white man's superiority, his arrogance, greed, and cruelty in its dreams of empire. So Cather in Behind the Singer Tower attacks some of America's most dearly held and flattering images of itself, in particular the glorification of what she calls the perpendicular, its, quote, scheme of life and progress and profit, a hierarchical and competitive society in which someone is always up, someone down, someone in first class, others in steerage, always keeping score, who wins the race, who's the most successful, who's the most intelligent. While both stories present implicit critique, neither writer is didactic in their message. If there is one, it is in a haze to be discerned by the reader. The Heart of Darkness ends with Marlowe sitting apart, indistinct, silent, in the pose of a meditating Buddha. The offing was barred by a black bank of clouds, and the tranquil waterway leading to the utmost ends of the earth flowed somber under an overcast sky, seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness. Behind the Singer Tower ends with a testy exchange, to Hallett's claim that, quote, someday a great idea will dawn serene and clear, justifying the present conflagration that's New York. Johnson aggressively asserts that, well, whatever it is, we are the people of doing it, and whatever it is, it will be ours. And then Hallett takes a final dig. Don't call anything ours, Johnson, while Zablosky is around. And Johnson turns irritably to Zablosky, who says, and why don't you ever hit back? But Zablosky, the young Jewish doctor, remains silent. His patience is greater, he knows more, his cultural history is longer. At the Rockefeller Institute, he is doing beneficial and important work, seeking the cure for infectious diseases. As the launch turns back toward the city, it is full of tension and to the suggestion of violence. Why don't you ever hit back? In author's notes, Conrad says of Heart of Darkness that its somber theme had to be given a sinister resonance, a tonality of its own, a continuous vibration that I hoped would hang in the air. Behind the Singer Tower also vibrates with a sinister resonance, for what lies behind the Singer Tower is also an immense darkness. Thank you.
To our three presenters for three fascinating papers. We have time for questions.
I can speak loudly.
It has to go. It has to
It's just a
go.
question about the poetry.
It has to go on the live stream.
Okay. About the poetry, or her reprints. Was she paid for all those reprints?
Yeah, I haven't been able to locate. You know, I haven't been able to locate any information about her getting paid. That was one of my interesting questions. Chuck Johannesmeyer's book on the literary syndicates in the late 1800s is really fascinating. And I mean, I would think I'd have to get into some of her checkbooks, her journals. You know, Willa kept, she was very particular about money. And if you look at her journals, she kept, so I'm not certain. I don't think she got paid for the late ones in the 20s, but probably there was some money coming in those early ones around 1901 to 1903. But I will need to be looking further into that. Thank you. Where's Tracy? She went.
So she wasn't sending those, she wasn't licking her own stamps in 1900 and sending out that. There was some kind of an organization that did that.
Yeah, I believe so, because there were, I see a lot of similar articles that appear in all four, maybe four of the papers, and there's kind of a whole system. Like I said, that one about celery and one about potato scabs. Those pieces seem to appear in a variety of newspapers around that time. So, and Townsend's ones, Hansen ones, his were all in the between 23 and 1927. Real, 20 years separating between the earlier publications of it.
I have a general question. I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, but thank you so much for your papers. Super interesting. And it's so interesting that Cather, she was working with so many different genres throughout her career, and her adventure was so starting as a critic. Did she ever aspire to be a playwright? I know she befriended playwrights, but is there any evidence that she wanted to write a play?
As far as I know, not. When she was a university student, she actually practiced the writing, and the first article, which was selected by her teacher and recommended to be published, it was also a comment on Thomas Carlyle. And then we can see that from the beginning, Willa Cather is one who is good at criticism, to comment something, to comment even a great writer, a great thinker. And then she was hired by the Nebraska State Journal. So she has that kind of talent of seeing things, I think. She is very sensitive, and she has the ability to express her own ideas, her views. So she, I think, as far as I knew that, I have not seen any traces about her willingness to write any plays by herself. Yeah, thank you.
She did actually write in dramatic form in some of her early writings. I was just trying to refresh my memory on titles here, but she did one, I think, on a railway stop or something like that, a conversation between people and so forth. So that, she dabbled in that. I don't think she...
When she was in the 1890s? Or?
I think it was that. I'm working on my Willa Cather archive stuff here. I don't have the title.
Yeah. That will be help. Willa Cather archive is very helpful. So I really feel gratitude to the Cather project. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I actually have one for Elaine. I think it's interesting, both Hallett and Marlowe, they are Hallett is sort of a class traitor. That's basically what Merriweather says. You've chosen your place down in the hole with the insert slur. Yes. And you have Marlowe being, really horrified and feeling sympathy with the exploited Congolese that he sees, but neither manages to kind of make that full leap into equality. Is that fair? Or there's still sort of this idea of these people as maybe the other who deserve sympathy, but are not maybe fully subjects with full humanity. I don't know, is that?
It's hard to guess, and you'd be guessing beyond what's actually in the text. Hallett, I think, and Cesarino were friends, but there was a class difference, a language difference that I think, I don't know what granting somebody their full humanity. I think beyond friends, he was doing something very unusual for his class.
But he's sort of condescending too at times to I like to see how much candy he not that.
Well, he said we enjoyed. Well, it was like Coney Island feeding. And it wasn't a relationship of equality.
Yes.
But it was a relationship in which he recognized and acknowledged Cesarino's, how do I want to say this? Existence as a full human being with a background in history, and he represented part of what Cather's doing is talking about Ischia and Cesarino is a small version of Caesar, and there's references to the great Roman empires, and so there's a sense of he might be a diminished Caesar at this point, but at some point America is going to be that sense of long history.
And that resonates with what you said about New York. That's great. I hadn't. New York, it's totally modern, no history at all. The immigrant is the one with the backstory.
Yeah, and if you look back, they're going back to the Persians and the Egyptians. What's left of the Egyptians? Sand. That's kind of the implication, and that's why it's scary to say liberty is just going to be an archaeological artifact. So I think this is the last story she wrote before Bohemian Girl. So I think she wrote it. She was copying Conrad, and she did decide she wanted to critique New York. That's my feeling, but then she decided, this isn't my métier. This is not the world my writing's going to come from. And then she went to Cherry Valley, and the rest is history.
Maybe you just answered this, but you said that she wrote this story, the Singer story, yellow, and to red meat because that sells papers. But did you say that she had trouble placing it?
Yeah.
If she had trouble, then why did she have trouble placing it if she wrote it to sell? Because it wasn't her, as you said here.
She was writing the kind of journalism that they called yellow journalism at the time. The Hearst papers were full of it, which was just, totally exaggerated and totally sensationalized. And when she wrote to a prospective buyer of the story that you might not like it, it's yellow, by which she meant it had these gory details. And in the story itself, they're journalists who come swarming around the accident and looking for the red meat that would sell papers. And so I was conflating two things there, partly because of time and writing, so she thought of this as a bit of yellow writing that she did herself, but she still wanted to sell it as a story. Is that helpful?
I have a title. The Westbound Train, a 30 minutes sketch for two people, which appeared in the Courier in September 30, 1899. It's in dramatic form. So anyway, that aside, just I'm thinking about that comment about yellow and a kind of self-deprecating, but also an invitation into that story, because I think I'm thinking about the Singer Tower in terms of there's a complexity, I think, to her treatment of these ethnicities. The fact that what you're talking about there with giving depth to an Italian immigrant, which at this time in the popular press, Italians are the lowest of the low. They're the ones who will not organize, for instance, in the labor industries, in the garment industries. They'll work and they don't think about anybody else. And for Cather to go kind of against that grain and to push back against these ethnicities, it seems to me is she's doing some important work there. It's subtle and I find that her work with both Zablowski and Cesarino doing that kind of social work. I mean, there's xeno-anxiety, I think, in the air that she's
Right.
trying to kind
Right.
of put out there in the open so that you can go a different direction with these characters.
Right, that's exactly the way I'm reading the story, and the importance of that discussion about what the Statue of Liberty means, and has it been replaced by this emblem of competition and commercial, and frankly, capitalism, and the tension remains on that boat with those people. Thank you. That's a very good comment.
Yeah, and you know, when you talk about the yellow aspect of it, because those guys, when they keep pushing against the doctor, they want him to explode, and they want him, you
Right,
know,
and
to be yellow.
that's a piece left out of the story, is a riff on the word yellow, because of course there's the yellow journalism, and there's the yellow hordes, and there's yellow bellies, and there's also those books that are from the turn of the century, which are the yellow books coming, you know, that are the aesthetes books, that are the Oscar Wilde books that have forbidden tales in them. So there's several paragraphs about yellow that don't belong in this book, in this paper. But exactly right, and she knows all that. That's behind some of the language.
And the, you know, behind, it's like the other side of silence, that behind the Singer Tower.
Yeah.
That, anyway.
And it's very Conradian in that she leaves it in mist, and she leaves it for us to decide.
I have a question for Xuesong. You, in your paper, you talked about highbrow and lowbrow. And it's funny because before you got there, I'd written in my notes when you were talking about Cather's early, shall we say, negative reviews, I'd written middlebrow. So I wonder if you could, that kind of, maybe it seems like she has a real problem with this kind of parlor culture and something, you know, I wonder if you could talk about that at all, or if you saw that, you know, this kind of, you know, these, she doesn't like, she talks about the drawing room and, you know, things that are maybe too respectable, if that's kind of part of her kind of, I was really convinced by what you said about the novel de Meublé and that kind of connecting to her aesthetics of drama. So I wonder if something about, you know, middlebrow, does that make sense? But.
I think Willa Cather herself, I remember I read a historical note written by her friend in a university time. She said, if Willa Cather is a scrub woman, she must be the one who scrub the strongest. You know, she is that kind of person. It is very impressive for us to understand her characteristic. Yeah, so that is why I suppose she has always set a very high standard, a very keen eye to things, especially for art. And this kind of sensitivity and a high standard, I think it is very important for her so that she can be a great writer, for her to always insist on some high standard in her own writing, to always produce some more and new novels. Yeah, and that is why she criticized those which is, in her eyes, mediocrity. Yeah.
Yeah, she doesn't want to be, she'd rather fail than be in the middle. That's so great.
Yeah, she does not want to fail. She is that kind of scrub woman who scrubs strongest.
Well, thanks to both our panelists and our audience.